We've got some really kind of exciting independent research that we've been working on here at RESI, and really looking forward to this opportunity to share it with you. I know for those of you that have heard me talk at either the event last year or at some other presentation in the past, first off, I'm sorry. But second off, you probably know that I really like to make these be more of a conversation. So I'm going to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. I want to get your feedback on kind of everything that we're showing and what you've seen. And then please find me afterwards at the kind of networking event that we have afterwards. I'm sure my view on this will be totally changed after a couple of beers and hors d'oeuvres in. So it'll be great. So we want to talk about employment and racial disparities in Maryland and Maryland's workforce pipeline. So to start, I just want to kind of set the stage with the idea that African Americans and white residents of this state experience really different realities. So educational attainment levels are very different depending on if you're looking at white Marylanders or black or African American Marylanders. The poverty rate is higher for black or African Americans in the state as well as in the city and in Baltimore County. You can see the bar charts over here. The difference in Baltimore City is really quite striking and is really glaring. Also, African Americans tend to earn less than white Maryland residents. And I think probably, when we think about wealth and we think about income, it's really stark to look at the wealth statistics within Baltimore. So 1/3 of Baltimore City households of color have zero or negative net worth, which is really striking. I mean, how are we going to have a diverse and inclusive workforce and economy if we have people who just have completely different levels of savings? So to kind of kick things off, before we get into our examination of segregation across different occupations, I want to start off by looking at something that was kind of put into place a really long time ago and has led to these really systemic effects that we still see today. So on the left-hand side of your screen is going to be a map of Baltimore City, showing the different areas of the city, different kind of loans. You'll see the infamous redlined areas kind of in the core of the city there. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see kind of a measure of what's called persistent segregation. So the areas that are in a deep red are census tracts within Baltimore City that are highly segregated and have been so since at least 1970 or before. So you can see that, from a long time ago when we had redlining instituted, that's left kind of these deep scars within Baltimore City. And so when we're looking at the rest of this presentation talking about occupational segregation and disparities, I think it's really important to keep this context in mind, that the policies that we're putting into place today and anything that we want to do to try and correct any inequalities that we see, that's going to have an impact a long time down the road. So it's important to study this, to understand it, to try and get it right. So to do that, I think it's important, before we get into everything, to talk about how we measure segregation, because how we measure segregation really matters. There's a whole lot of different ways we can do it, and so I've got this really simple example that I just kind of want you to think about. So let's just assume that economists are about 70% male. How do we go about deciding whether or not this is a segregated occupation? So one way we could do that is we could say, well, we should think it should be a 50-50 split. It should be about 50% men, 50% women. So by that metric, then yes, economists would be a pretty segregated occupation. But let's say we're looking at a county where about 70% of the county's workforce is male. So then we might say, okay, well then we would expect every occupation to be about 70% male and 30% female. So in that case, economists would not be necessarily segregated. Well, that's not the only variable that we can consider. So one of the really important ones to think about would be education. So perhaps, yes, 70% of the workers in this hypothetical county are male, but let's say that the women are more highly educated. And so we would really be expecting to see only about 60% of economists be male. So the fact that 70% of economists are male means that there's something kind of going on under the surface. So it's one of the things that we don't necessarily do is control for education. And I think that that's really important when we're looking at the differences in representation between different groups. Education can vary for a whole host of different reasons, whether that's between different races or different genders or any other group that you want to take a look at. So, you can have different people self-selecting, there can be cultural norms, there could be different implicit biases limiting people from going into any other group. And there can be poverty. So for example, if I have my family has a 1/3, is part of that 1/3 of households of color with 0 or negative net worth, it's going to be really hard for me to afford or even have that enter into my reality to think about higher education. So what we did here at RESI is we want to kind of separate out. So there are inequalities when it comes to education and the way that people are distributed across our colleges and universities. And that's something we're going to look at a little later. But we also want to look at what are some other biases that might be present in our workforce. So to do that, we're going to be building off of some work that goes all the way back to 1978 with Bergman and has continued up. There's a lot of other really influential economists. We're kind of building off work by Darity, Michelle Holdman, looking at occupational crowding. And so the idea behind occupational crowding, a really kind of simple ratio here, is it's the percent of whatever group you're looking at in any given occupation. So say, for economists, say 70% of economists are males. That'd be your top number. And then the bottom number is the percent of the group, so the percent of males that have the necessary education. So, when you divide these two numbers across each other, you'll get a ratio that will tell you whether or not this occupation or this region of the country, whatever it is that you're examining, how under or overrepresented it is. So we talk about crowding whenever there's a ratio above 1. And the metric that we use is 1.1 because we know that there's going to be a lot of kind of noise in our data. We'll get to that later. So if there's something where you say you have, the number comes out and it's 2, that means that, say, men or African Americans or whites are twice as likely to be employed in this occupation than we would expect. And so the language that we kind of use is they're being crowded into this occupation for some reason other than their level of education. There's also, not just when we look at things at the level of each individual occupation, but we want to talk about how do we measure segregation and the way that people are distributed across an economy when we have lots of different occupations, and those occupations have different sizes to them. So here you've got kind of a really simple hypothetical economy. You've got economists that are now 60% male, and you have doctors that are about 25% male. So how do we measure whether or not this is a truly segregated economy? So the way we do that is there's some Greek letters up there. You don't have to worry about it. It's called the Duncan Index of dissimilarity. And so what this does is you calculate out the math, and it tells you the percentage of workers in a group that would have to switch jobs to balance out the economy. So if we take a look at our example here where 60% of the workforce is male, 25% of the doctors are male, you add everything out, you get this nice Duncan Index number of 25%. So what that means is that you need to move 25% of one group, men or women, in order to balance out the economy. So we do that, we move 2 of the 8 men from being economists to being doctors, and now we've got a nice 50-50 split. So that's kind of a really simple, general way of thinking about segregation across the entire industries. So what we did here at RESI is we wanted to take a look at occupational crowding within Maryland. We also focused in specifically on Baltimore City, as well as 5 different regions of the state. As I mentioned before, we built on a lot of previous studies that have looked more nationwide. And we use 5-year data from the ACS that's reported and hosted through IPUMS. And so when we run everything, what we end up finding is that within Baltimore City, blacks or African Americans are crowded into 8 major occupation categories. So we started out looking at 521 really detailed level occupations, and we aggregated those up to looking at 22 2-digit level SOC codes, if you're familiar with those. And so these are the ones where African Americans within Baltimore City are crowded in. And one of the first things that kind of jumps out is that African Americans within Baltimore City are more likely to work in healthcare. They are also much more likely to be employed in lower paying jobs. So of the 8 jobs that blacks or African Americans are crowded into within Baltimore City, 6 of those have median annual wages below the Maryland average. So the Maryland average is about $57,000, give or take a few hundred. And so all of the occupations that are listed in yellow there are below that value. So there is still some good news. Post-recession, so from 2009 onwards, African Americans in Baltimore City have diversified the legal occupations. So if you look at 2009 on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see that African Americans had an occupational crowding score of about 0.8. So that means there was 20% less likely to be employed in legal occupations than we would expect, given the levels of education that Blacks or African Americans have within Baltimore City. By 2016, that has gone up to about 1.3, 1.4%, or 1.4, which means that they're about 40% more likely to be employed in legal occupations than we would expect. So there's been some really great strides in the legal occupations, and this is across all levels of legal occupations. So this is across paralegals, and it also holds true for the high-priced, high-paying lawyer jobs as well. So that's really kind of some good news. Interestingly, whites within Baltimore also have a really high occupational crowding statistic, and so what that indicates is that what's really happening is that Hispanics, Asians, and other races and ethnicities are kind of being crowded out of these legal occupations. It's also important to note that although there was diversification within Baltimore City, this white line here, which shows diversification statewide, is remaining pretty constant. So whites and Blacks or African Americans are pretty proportional within the legal profession statewide, but we're not seeing that same level of diversification that we did within Baltimore City. So not only did we look at occupations where African Americans were crowded into, but we looked at what occupations Blacks or African Americans within Baltimore City were crowded out of. So where did they have the lowest occupational crowding scores? And so there were 7 of the 22 major occupation categories that we looked at that had these scores that were below 0.9. And they're listed over here on the left-hand side. And I think one of the most important things to note here is that 3 of the 5 occupations in Maryland with the highest wages are shown up on this screen. So for example, management has the highest average annual wage in Maryland. The wage is about $127,000 a year, and African Americans are underrepresented in management. So that's a really telling statistic and something that we definitely need to be paying more attention to. There have been some bright spots here as well. So post-recession, African Americans within Baltimore City have increased their share of employment in architecture and engineering professions. So in 2009, just after the recession, African Americans were about 40% less likely to be employed in architecture and engineering occupations than we would expect, given their levels of education. However, by 2016, that's approached about just under 0.9, about 0.8, 0.85, which means they're only about 15% less likely to be employed in architecture and engineering occupations. So that's some really good news, but obviously we still have some work to go in order to try and get this higher level occupational category to truly represent the workforce that we have here in the state. Again, similar diversification statewide did not happen for architecture and engineering occupations, and unlike with the legal professions where you saw that line was about 1, for architecture and engineering, African Americans are still about 40% less likely to be employed in those occupations than we'd expect. And that has not changed from 2009 to 2016. It's very, very constant. So while there's some bright spots in Baltimore City, it's really important that when we consider the Baltimore metro area, the suburbs of DC, Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, that we really try and focus on ways to encourage more and more African American participation in these occupations. So we looked at 521 occupations, and for the previous several slides, we grouped them up into the 22 major occupational categories. So, paralegals, lawyers, all got grouped up into legal. But what we also did is we looked at the median wage for every occupation of these 521 occupations, and we grouped them into low-paying, medium-paying, and high-paying. So a low-wage job is one that has an annual average salary of below $40,000. Between $40,000 and $70,000 is a medium wage, and over $70,000 a year is going to be a high-wage job that you see here. And what's important to note is that post-recession, the share of Blacks or African Americans in low-wage, medium-wage, and high-wage jobs has stayed very, very constant. But troublingly, that we see that African Americans are about 20% more likely to be in low-wage jobs than we would expect given their levels of education. And unfortunately, when we look to the future, so not just what's happened post-recession, But we want to think about, well, what's going to happen in 10 years, 15 years down the line? So we also looked at jobs by how resistant they're going to be to automation. So this chart over here is showing you the types of jobs that are going to be they require a lot of critical thinking and problem-solving skills. So they're called non-routine cognitive. So there's a job that changes absolutely every day. It's fast-moving, and it really involves a lot more of thinking than it does working with your hands. And African Americans are crowded out of those jobs, whereas white Marylanders have a higher representation than we would expect. So we've kind of looked at the occupational crowding scores, and so I also want to look at the Duncan Index for Baltimore City and statewide. So what's happening across the whole economy, not just occupation by occupation. And this is the Duncan Index over here, and you can see that for Baltimore City, the Duncan Index showing what percentage of the workforce would need to change in order to balance out our economy has risen post-recession. So it started off about 40% of one group would need to change occupations in order to have a balanced economy. And by 2016, that's risen up to just about 45%. Although we've seen this in Baltimore City, we have not seen this within the greater Baltimore metro area. And we also have not seen this statewide. So Baltimore City is starting to become a little bit more and more segregated. We're not seeing that at the same levels. And there's a couple reasons why this might be. One reason is that other areas of the state are kind of segregating in the other direction, and so they kind of balance out and everything looks constant. It's something that we're going to be kind of taking a look into and diving into more. But it's something that's really troubling when we're looking at Baltimore City and the inequalities that we see here. So we kind of want to switch gears. So this is looking at everything that we've seen of what our workforce looks like right now. But we also want to look at where our workforce is going. So to do that, we looked at graduation rates by race and by major for all 2-year and 4-year colleges within the state of Maryland. And one thing that's really important and is kind of a nice little thing to see is that between 1996 and 2016, more African Americans are graduating from Maryland colleges and universities. So this chart is showing you the percentage of Maryland graduates that are Black or African American. There is still a lot of room and a lot of work to be done because statewide, African Americans make up about 30% of our population. So although we're seeing higher rates of African Americans graduating from our colleges and universities, we still have a lot of room to do better. We also looked at the Duncan Index statewide. So this is looking at, by major, how segregated are Maryland's colleges and universities. And you can see that over time, segregation in college majors has remained relatively constant. I think one thing that is really kind of interesting to note in here, and is something we want to look into a little bit more, is that you'll notice it is relatively constant, but there's a little bit of a spike starting in 2011, 2012, and 2013. And what that indicates is 4 years prior, you had the recession. And so it is indicating that white Marylanders and Black Marylanders reacted to the recession and reacted to the broader macroeconomy in very different ways. And so it's going to be really interesting to try and kind of dig into that and see exactly what's going on. One thing also that I do want to mention, just while I'm on this slide, is that Towson University, just as a small shout out to President Schatzel, is that we have the second lowest Duncan Index of the state. Which is great. So we're about 16%. So you would need to move about 16% of Towson graduates around in order to achieve a truly balanced and proportional representation across all majors. That goes up, it varies wildly by school. Some schools have as high as about a 30% Duncan Index, which is obviously means that people are in very, very different majors, and they're not interacting with people the same way that they might in other campuses. So this chart here is showing you, so across Maryland, so for all 2-year and 4-year institutions in the state, what are the differences in majors between African Americans and white graduates? So what are people doing slightly differently? And this is by absolute value. So you can see that business majors, there's the highest difference. So about 20% of African American graduates in the state graduate with business degree of some sort, whereas about 15.5% of white graduates in the state graduate with a business degree. So of the 8 occupations here, about 5 have larger shares of African Americans than white students. So you can see those are business, criminal justice, health, public administration, and human services. So we wanted to take kind of a deeper dive into some of these larger major categories to see what's going on with them. And one of the ones that we looked at is, okay, business has the largest discrepancy here. And African Americans are choosing to graduate with business degrees more than white students. But when you look at the types of majors within business that African Americans and white students are graduating with, you can see there's a lot of differences. So within business majors, African Americans tend to graduate with more general, less specialized degrees. So the percentages that you see here are the percent of all students graduating with that major that are African American. So for finance, about 13% of all finance graduates statewide are African American. So finance, marketing, accounting, these are really, really high-paying, great jobs. And we can see that African Americans tend to be underrepresented in these majors compared to others. We also looked at kind of computer-related occupations. So, everyone kind of knows cybersecurity is going to increasingly be a big deal in this state. Not only do we have great military installations such as Fort Meade that are really enhancing cybersecurity, but it's just, IT in general is just on the swing and on the rise. And you can see that some of the highest paying majors, which would be the computer science majors, African Americans tend to be in those occupations the least. So again, there are a lot of computer science majors, but they tend to be out of some of the highest paying best pathways, best career majors. And so that's something that we definitely need to be looking at, so not just at a high level and say, okay, African Americans and white students within Maryland seem to be relatively equal across computer-related occupations, but what are they actually majoring in? How do those pathways look different? And so you may remember before we were looking at architecture and engineering, and we're showing that African Americans were diversifying the architecture and engineering space. And that is really good news, but unfortunately, Blacks or African Americans are constituting a shrinking proportion of engineering students statewide. This isn't a major decline, but it is a pretty substantial trend that you can see looking at 20 years of graduation data. The rate now is hovering about just below 10%, and so that's obviously very, very troubling. So when we think about everything that we've seen in this study, there are a lot of ways that we can correct segregation, and we can kind of start to talk about ways to move ourselves forward in Baltimore, in the Baltimore region, and in Maryland. And so I think there are a lot of really great ways to do that, and I'm really excited to hear all of the lightning presentations that we have coming up. I know there's some great ones looking at workforce training programs and pre-apprenticeship programs, and so I'm really excited about that, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder. So I'm going to focus on just a couple other things that we might want to think about and consider. And so one of those is transportation. So what this map is showing you is kind of the downtown Baltimore area. Areas that are highlighted in red are, quote, transportation barriers, or they're large roads. So you can see I-40 on the west side, I-83 and the rail lines coming down the middle of the city. And these are roads that are going to inhibit pedestrians from walking around. You can also see in yellow, it might be a little faded out, I'm not entirely sure, but you can see in yellow, these are called institutional barriers. So these are, if you've got the convention center, think of downtown, where it's 3 blocks of just this monolithic building, and it's the same thing, and it's not really encouraging people to keep walking in a given direction. So you're not going to pop out of one shop, walk down a block and go to the next if you just see 3 blocks of the same thing, or if you're walking by Greenmount Cemetery or the prison complex. And one thing that I think is really important to see here is the kind of whitish area, the clear area in the middle that is surrounded by all of these barriers to pedestrian growth and movement. You see the Inner Harbor, and you see the really wealthy Mount Vernon area. And so you can kind of see from this map how our transportation barriers and how the institutional barriers that we've kind of created over time have kind of worked to kind of hold in the growth within Baltimore City and inhibit some of that wealth transfer from the Inner Harbor and from Mount Vernon out to East and West Baltimore. This isn't necessarily, everywhere, every city in the world is going to have some sort of sports stadium, some sort of convention center. You're going to need to have some sort of roads that move people around. The answer is not to just destroy all of these buildings, but one thing we need to think about is how we have a public transportation system that's going to connect people from where they live to downtown, to Sparrows Point, to the Amazon headquarters, where they can get to work. And another thing that I think is very important to discuss when we're talking about segregation across occupations is kind of the root and the foundation of all of this, which would be our public schools. So this image, many of you may have seen this image. It was all over the news this past winter. And these are Baltimore City students kind of huddled up in like 5 layers of jackets because their schools don't have heat. So obviously, if students are not in great infrastructure, if they don't have the same level of spending spent on their schools that other areas of the state do, if they're dealing with these really systemic issues, if their classmates are getting killed, which has happened to several Baltimore students over the past month, that's going to really inhibit their ability to learn and their ability to do well. So we really need to focus not just on ensuring that our students have a great higher education, but I think it's also really important to remember that we need to take a step back and start from the beginning and really look at our public schools. And so with that, I would like to kind of hear more from you guys, get some of your input, your feedback, and find maybe some ways that we can continue to expand this analysis. And thank you very much.
So I've got 2 questions for you.
All right.
One of your early slides was showing disparities or opportunities for African Americans versus whites. And Baltimore City had a very wide variable. Baltimore County had a very small variable. I was wondering what was going on there, number 1. And number 2, your most recent slides were particularly in education for African American graduates in college. There was a big jump, a 5% jump between 1996 and 2001, and then it sort of just tailed off. And also in your slide for engineering, there was a similar 5% jump in African Americans, between that 96 to 2001 time frame, and then it started moving around. I'm just wondering what dynamic was happening in 96 to 2001 that stopped.
Sure. That is a great question. For your second one that I don't have the answer for, but I think it's something that would be really, really great to dig into. I'm not sure if anyone here has any ideas, but I think, it's definitely what lessons can we learn from that time period and see if we can take that and move it forward. When it comes to comparing Baltimore City to Baltimore County, I think one of the most important things to consider and the interplay between the city and the county and the greater Baltimore region would be one of the very early slides that I showed looking at redlining. What you tended to have was, you would have people with the means to move out of those areas, move to the suburbs, which continued not just in the early 1900s, but also even today. You have people who move into Fed Hill and Locust Point, and then they hit, their mid-20s and they're out off to the suburbs. And I think that that's one of the things that's going on. You have people who have, there hasn't been the same tax base within Baltimore City that you have in Baltimore County because people moved out as a result of public policies that were put in place 100 years ago and just de facto policies that we've had in this country for even longer. And I think that's probably the big reason that there's such a difference between Baltimore City and Baltimore County. Yes?
Why didn't you just focus on Baltimore City alone? I mean, you looked at the statistics for African Americans, and it sounded like you were bashing us. That's how I feel about it. However, there's other areas that you could look at besides Baltimore City. I mean, everybody focuses on Baltimore City, but it's a lot that goes on in other counties, in Baltimore County, Howard County, Harford County,
Sure.
and the rest of the counties as well. And I noticed that you talked about how poor a lot of African Americans were, according to your statistics, compared to Caucasian people. But you have to look at the whole group. You can't just focus on Baltimore City and look at Baltimore City alone. You have to look at the whole state of Maryland. So we're not just talking about people in Baltimore City that's living in poverty. It's all over the state of Maryland. So when you do your statistics and you go all the way back to 1978, you need to make sure you come up to date to 2008. And a lot of the people that you say are not educated, some people are educated. So don't just look at the negative aspect of it, look at the positive aspect of it too. A lot of people that are educated are moving forward and have moved forward. So when you do your statistics, look at the whole matter, not just Baltimore City.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. I do just want to clarify one thing. I, in no means, was trying to disparage anybody. I think, you know, my aim here, and I'm sorry if that didn't quite come across, was I just wanted to show the disparities that do exist, because I don't think they're the fault of any African Americans that are in the city. I don't think anyone sets out to be poor. I think there are systemic issues that are within our city, within our county, within our state, and our country that have operated to give different groups of people different opportunities. I think you're right that, you know, it's incredibly important to note the successes of different African Americans within Baltimore City and within the state. And I think, you know, when we look at the state and the Baltimore region as a whole, there are some really great things happening, and I don't think that we should discount that. You're absolutely right. But I do also want to focus in on Baltimore City, because I think that it's really important that there have been these very impactful public policies that were put in place to specifically to kind of oppress certain groups of people, and I think it's important to comment on that and to recognize that, and not to use that to discount the success of anyone, but instead to say, you know, there is work that needs to be done in order to kind of correct these imbalances. But I would love to talk with you more after this too, and try and maybe find a better way to present it. So. Any other questions? Or yes?
Good afternoon. I'm Jasmine. I work here at Towson in Human Resources, and I'm curious, were you able to look at allocation of finance and resources like loans and student loans and access that people have to student loans and graduation rates? Mm-hmm. Was that taken into account in any of your data? And I'm curious if it mirrors your graphs, like if people don't have access to student loans or their parents have poor credit, is that a reason why people don't graduate?
Yeah, so I think you're 100% correct. I think that's from one of the earlier slides where we were looking at why education might differ, levels of education might differ across different groups. And one of the reasons is that people don't have access to the same resources that others do. So I know that when I was going and applying to colleges, my parents both came in, they created all these like binders full of, okay, we're going to this school, here's the scholarships we should apply for, here's how we're gonna do the financial aid. And if you come from a different background and you're not used to having someone deal with that, that's very different. That's very difficult to look at. In terms of the statistics that we are presenting up here in terms of occupational crowding, in terms of the Duncan Index for segregation, that's controlling for levels of education. And so it is controlling for those differences. But I think you're absolutely right that we need to remember and keep in mind that levels of education differ across different groups. I do know that there have been some really interesting studies that I've read recently looking at the access to capital that different groups have, and that is very, very different across racial and ethnic lines. And that's true across the whole state of Maryland. And so I think that's, I don't necessarily have those statistics up here, but I mean, I know that you can get those, and it's very troubling. So, I thought I saw a hand up here.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a really very interesting presentation. It's been a little while since I've been in an economics class, so my mind was struggling a little bit with the definition of occupational crowding.
Sure.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what that really means. I know you said that it was the number of people from a group in an occupation divided by the number of people in that same group with necessary education. And I wasn't clear when you said necessary education, for example, in engineering, do you mean a bachelor's degree or do you mean a degree in engineering? And so,
right.
And then second part of that question is then, so what does that really mean? Are you saying that there are more people who are educationally qualified when there's when it's, mm-hmm. Is it a measure of how many people who are educationally qualified for that job that are not getting employed in that job for which they're educationally qualified? Is that, could you explain a little bit more
Yes,
about what that
yeah,
means?
no, absolutely. So I think it's very easy for me, since I stare at, Greek letters and numbers all day, to just kind of be like, oh yeah, this ratio, it's great. And that doesn't always translate to everybody else. My poor wife, who's sitting in the back there, knows that better than anyone. Um, so occupational crowding, you're absolutely right. So if you have a proportion where you say it's in 1.2, and we're saying there's 20% of a given group, so say 20% more men are employed in this occupation than we would expect given their levels of education. What that means is that you have more men employed in for this example, most of what tends to happen is that African Americans within Maryland as a whole, as well as within Baltimore and the greater Baltimore region, tend to be crowded into jobs that they're overqualified for. Whereas white residents of the state tend to, for the same job, tend to have lower educational achievement. In terms of what specifically we're looking at for education, that's an excellent question. It's something we kind of glossed over. What we're doing is we're looking at the BLS as a whole, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has a whole bunch of different ways that they measure and report and take censuses on for each occupation. What levels of education do you have? What skills? What trainings? And so we looked at the level of education that you would need to have to be within between the 25th and the 90th percentile for education within that group. So for example, economists, you've got myself, I just have a master's degree. Our chief economist, Darius, has a PhD. And we have some very excellent economists on staff here at RESI that just have their bachelor's. So we would be looking at all three of those levels of education. Unfortunately, we're not necessarily able to zoom in and look at the individual major level. It's something that we could do, but it gets the way that the data is reported out from the American Community Survey, and I kind of glossed over some of the methodology, but the American Community Survey is a survey. And so for each year, you have about 29,000 responses from just Baltimore City. And when we are looking at that by race and 521 different levels of, just levels of education, that's really, really fine, and there's already kind of the chance for a lot of error to get built into some of these statistics. But if we're to try and look at the number of Baltimore City residents or Garrett County residents with a bachelor's degree in economics or a doctorate in physics, the error bars on that are just so high, so we're trying to just kind of control for broad levels of education. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a really good approximation. Does that kind of help make things a little bit more clear? Okay, great. Yeah.
Oh, I have the mic.
Oh, yes.
My question is, I noticed that your study was just between blacks and whites. Are you going to do a comparison, or do you have plans to do comparisons between other ethnic groups and
Yes.
how,
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason that we chose to focus on the differences between blacks, African Americans, and white residents of the state, as well as graduates, was really kind of a sample. One of the big reasons is a sample size. So we want to, and we are looking at Hispanics and Asians. It's very difficult when you drill down to the county level, when only about 4 or 5% of the population is a given race or ethnicity, to really have confidence in your estimates for the numbers of people of those races that are employed in different occupations. It's something that we do want to look at, and we're building into our analyses. We're building into kind of estimates on equity by considering Asians, Hispanics, and other races as well. It's not something that we focused on here, partly just for time. I didn't want to inundate everybody with 10 million slides, even though I could talk all day about it. But also just because the distribution of the population within Maryland is so heavily oriented towards those two groups as well. Yes, I see a question in the back.
Look at the demographics and how strong they are, what companies must do to understand them and what actions they must take. So I wonder, in your research, do you have recommendations in terms of, based on what you see, how can the workforce community make practical steps to make an impact, and how can we partner to help organizations like governmental organizations to counteract some of these policies and so forth?
Sure. So I think obviously, the old adage of the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have a problem holds true. And I think that's where we kind of see ourselves stepping in here at RESI, is kind of looking at the research, trying to understand what the differences and the disparities are. I think moving forward, it's one thing I'm really excited for the next series of talks, because I think there's going to be some more kind of practical, hands-on ways that have been proven. So I know our director, our VP of Diversity and Inclusion here at Towson University is going to actually speak on building a diverse and inclusive workforce. I think it's really important that we focus on making sure that all perspectives are heard. I think, we are stronger when we're hearing from people with different points of view than us. And it's just recognizing that there are differences in our workforce, and trying to find ways to be conscious of that and to try and start to work towards fixing that. I know within the economics profession, I went to kind of the big economics conference this past January, and there's this really interesting talk by these African-American economists talking about ways to increase interest in economics. And one of the, for Black or African-American students, and one of the big things they said is, it's really difficult to be interested in anything when you don't see people that look like you. And when you go to an economics conference, it's a lot more people that look like me than anybody else. And B, it's really important that we think about the ways that we're talking about economics or whatever our discipline is in ways that don't insult or diminish anyone's role. So kind of the traditional economics way of thinking is that people tend to make choices. We all start from the same plane. We're all equally rational. And when you look at that way of thinking and you look at the segregation that we see within Baltimore City and the disparities in opportunity, it's really difficult to square that with a traditional economic lens. So I think it's just finding ways for us to update all of our ways of thinking to kind of match the realities on the ground is going to be really important.